As Stevenson Center regulars know, I am Nancy Stevenson, president of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. Welcome to new friends who have joined us today because of Gerald Adelmann and the importance of the topic, saving the planet. My husband, Adlai, chairman of the center, died almost 2 weeks ago after a long illness. He spoke constantly of his admiration for on-the-ground practitioners, a phrase he used like a mantra about people who actually do things to improve the world around them. One of his goals throughout his life was to work across borders for the common good. In politics, across the aisle. In state policies, across county lines, upstate and downstate. In national policies, across state boundaries. And in international relations, across national borders. Gerald Adelmann, known as Jerry by the legions of people who know and work with him, fulfills these goals. He is a doer, thinking up positive projects and then carrying them out with endless outreach efforts. His first was the I&M Canal Trail when he was just a kid in grad school. Everyone he consulted, and I was lucky to be one of those, said, "Wonderful idea, Jerry, but it will take lots of work. Probably impossible to bring all those communities and corporations together." But Jerry persisted. People have been hiking and biking this trail for years with boosts to all the communities on the route. Jerry is Mr. Collaborator. I've never heard him speak of any project on his full list of projects without naming and thanking other people for their contributions of time and talent. Of course, he does not frown on monetary gifts that support essential time and talent. He works for the common good across aisles in politics, across county borders and state borders too. In fact, he also has worked across international borders. More about that a little bit later. He was chosen to lead Openlands when it was already a force for the environment, with visions of creating clean air, water, accessible land for creation and mental peace. As you will see today, he has grown that format to broaden rural and inner city engagement and communities. Jerry believes in utilizing government, nonprofits, the arts, school kids and elders, those who are capable of wielding a trowel or a shovel, and those who can only work at home. Everyone can contribute in Jerry's world. He has even worked to open conservation ideas in China and now Burma, but that's another story. Take it away, Jerry, about things that are happening and what we can do to save the planet.
Well, good afternoon, and Nancy, thank you so much for that wonderful that wonderful introduction. I have to start, obviously, by saying how sorry we are about the loss of Adlai and extend my sympathy to you and your family and so many others. I mean, he was just the model of civic leadership and engagement. And as you point out, you know, when I was in graduate school, I had a pre-doctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian, beginning to put together this crazy idea of sort of a partnership park along an industrial corridor. His office was the first I turned to, and they showed interest. And then I met you. Oh my gosh, then everything started changing. You introduced me to Mary Bain, who is the head of Sidney Yates's office, who was such a powerful force in our delegation, and things started to happen. And you, of course, continued to work closely with me, joining the Canal Corridor Association, the group that grew out of Openlands, to provide leadership. So I have such admiration for you, for Adlai, and the loss is great, but what a great legacy. So it's a real honor to be with you today.
Thank you,
what I'd like to do is show some slides and talk about Openlands work, but as it relates to challenges that cities and metropolitan areas really face across the country. and then relate it to some of the opportunities that are emerging with the Biden administration in Washington. So if we could go to the first slide, that would be great. Pull that up here. So Openlands is quite a remarkable organization, way before my time, founded in 1963. And it was one of the first in the country to focus in a large metro area. At that time, which was kind of the birth of the modern environmental movement, you know, the year before, Silent Spring had been published, Rachel Carson's landmark work. This was the time when, you know, EPA was created, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, just in Earth Day a few years later. It was an exciting time, but conservation was focused really on rural areas and on wilderness. So Openlands was one of the first to say, no, people live in cities, nature is in cities, we must connect them. And because of that, Openlands always had to be kind of creative. There weren't models to follow. We were the group that first focused on Lake Michigan. There was no advocacy group. We launched Lake Michigan Federation that became the Alliance for the Great Lakes. In a similar way, the Chicago River was kind of our forgotten waterfront. And Openlands launched Friends of the Chicago River, which was housed with Openlands for 10 years and now is a very powerful independent not-for-profit with whom we partner often and has played such an impressive role in connecting all of us to the river and to the challenges and opportunities that it presents. We got involved with the first conversion of an abandoned railroad into hiking and biking trail, the Prairie Path. May Theogard Watts came to us and said, help us. And Gunnar Peterson, our founding director, really not only helped with that, but helped launch nationally the trail movement. And I know Ad on your farm in Joe Davis County was hoping to do just that with a railroad. It didn't succeed, but he had that vision. And so kindred spirit throughout. Let's see, the next slide here. It's not going. Good, let's see. There we are, whoops. That's not the right, there. So this is where Openlands works. The purple area is our geography. So parts of Indiana, Wisconsin, and northeastern Illinois. The broader, greener footprint there is the geography in which there's an extraordinary coalition working called Chicago Wilderness. We were one of the founders, and it brings together all the governmental players, the land managers, federal, state, local, major institutions like the Field Museum, Brookfield Zoo, the Shed, on, and also the array of not-for-profit conservation groups to really try to coordinate efforts in this broad area that is so fragmented. It's one of the most complicated geopolitical regions in the country. And Illinois has no land use policy as a state. We make our decisions at the municipal level about land use. Well, rivers, streams, habitat, biodiversity obviously don't reflect political boundaries, don't respect them. They cut across them. And so that's where a regional not-for-profit like Openlands, can play a very important role. We happen to live in one of the richest ecological areas, one of the most biologically diverse in the country. That's a surprise to many. And here's a map that shows what our natural resources were in 1830, when the first permanent white settlers came to this region that Native Americans had recognized as so important and as a strategic gateway between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi for millennia. But you can see the dark green is forest, that kind of grayish is prairie. Look at the huge wetlands that we have, especially in Indiana. And this is where the forests of the East met the prairie of the West. It was an ecotone and extraordinary biodiversity represented here. Also, in many ways, the least likely place to build a great city, great metropolis, on a swamp, a marsh, but this gateway to the West, if you want, because of the water system. And so here we are in 2000, pretty dramatic change. The prairie's gone. The gray area is farmland. Red is urbanization. You notice those big blue swaths of wetlands are largely gone as well. But if you look closely at that green, or rather at the red, the developed area, you'll see lots of green. Thank God. I mean, that was the vision that people had here. The Burnham Plan, really set the stage for the creation of the Cook County Forest Preserve, which was the first of its kind in the country, now owning over 10% of Cook County. It's that vision that is so important that continues to today, represented in many respects by Chicago Wilderness, this broad coalition. But the UN report, Making Peace with Nature, just issued this year, says that today climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution add up to 3 self-inflicting planetary crises that are closely interconnected and put the well-being of current and future generations at unacceptable risk. Today more than ever, after 18 months of COVID, I think Americans and people around the world, but especially in this country, have recognized the power of nature in their lives, the importance of it, in a way that I've never seen expressed publicly before. There's such a broad range of health benefits to nature, community health, but also personal health and psychological well-being. And while the work of Openlands is focused in a large metropolitan area, we don't have huge landscapes like out west and other parts of the country, but we have people. And 80% of Americans, now live in metropolitan areas, over half of the world's population. So when you think of the vision of Openlands, it's always been people and the land. We were formed by the Welfare Council of Metropolitan Chicago. So we care deeply, about biodiversity, about protecting and enhancing the green infrastructure of our region, which today is more critical than ever given the challenges of climate, but it also directly affects the quality of life of the people who live here. And if we aren't connecting in meaningful ways with the people who live in these large metro areas, who will be the advocates for wilderness preservation, for protecting and enhancing nature close to home and across the nation world is so critical. So what I'd like to do is just show a little video here that will give you a flavor of some of our community conservation work that I think is reflective of what many others are doing around the country as well. So if we could see that video, that would be great. Great. Now, if we could go back to the slides there, I think pictures, are always powerful, and I convey far more powerfully in many ways. Let's see if we could go back to the slides after the video. Yeah, there we are. What was touched on there were water trails. The defining features of our landscape are our rivers and streams. And we did a lot to improve water quality, but relatively little to create access, especially for canoeing and kayaking. And part of the challenge is that these waterways run through multiple jurisdictions. Often the reach in one geographic or political area is too small to develop a trail. So Openlands, working again with many partners, forest preserve districts, conservation districts, some of the key park districts, our regional planning organization, the predecessor of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, came together and developed the first comprehensive blueways or water trails plan in the nation, actually, identifying over 500 miles of rivers and streams that are suitable for canoeing and kayaking. That was 15, almost 20 years ago. And we and the partners who are involved in managing these trails and citizen volunteers have been working ever since to realize that vision. And there are now canoe launches up and down the waterways, volunteer groups that are cleaning out log jams and so forth, students that are doing water monitoring, water quality monitoring. So it's become a really marvelous new resource for our region. And the African-American Heritage Water Trail that was featured in the little video is 7 miles along the Little Calumet that encompasses an extraordinary narrative about African-American heritage in our region, including the birthplace of environmental justice at Altgeld Gardens with Cheryl Johnson's mother, Hazel. Cheryl is still actively involved with and this is where Barack Obama got his start as an organizer. But very importantly, short distance away was the Tun Farm. It was an underground railroad station, and going all the way to Robbins, which had the first African-American airport and where the Tuskegee Airmen trained. So rich stories, but also marvelous recreational opportunities. Collectively, we talk about the urban forest, all the trees that are here on public and private land. And Chicago, sadly, our tree canopy percentage has dropped from 19 to 16%, very low, lower than most major metropolitan areas, lower than New York and Los Angeles and other big cities. And that's a crisis. Emerald ash borer obviously has contributed significantly to that, but also lack of coordination and policy. And so our tree keeper program is really quite impressive. 30 years old this year, 2,000 volunteers from all walks of life who learn all about trees and their care, how to plant them, how to prune, mulch, identify disease and so forth. And they're the stewards then of that urban forest, working in neighborhoods throughout the city and now in chapters in the suburbs as well. Fortunately, as a region, we have also a really visionary program called the Chicago Region Tree Initiative, launched by Morton Arboretum. We've been a close partner with them, with many other public agencies and not-for-profits, but looking collectively at the 7-county area, trying to identify ways in which we can improve the tree canopy and the health of our urban forests, because we know how important it is, absorbing carbon, stormwater, cleaning our air, cooling us in hot days, and providing the psychological and human health benefits that we all need now more than ever. Another program that really is tied to climate and quality of life is our Space to Grow program. And this is a total transformation of campuses, Chicago public school campuses here in Chicago. We're built on a swamp. So these were paved, no green space in many cases, not even a playground, few if any trees, hostile environments for our children, but heart and soul of neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that have serious issues with flooding. And so by transforming these campuses, absorbing huge amounts of stormwater, making outdoor classrooms available, they function as parks when school's not in session. They become tremendous assets. We partner with the Healthy Schools campaign on the program side, and we work with the entire school community planning these and neighbors. But the funding side is very important because they're quite expensive. But the Water Reclamation District, the City of Chicago, and Chicago Public Schools have pots of money that can qualify here. In the case of the city and the Water Reclamation District, they need to get stormwater in the ground where it falls. So we plan these so that we can quantify how much stormwater is absorbed, but then all these wonderful benefits for the kids, creative programs, working with the teachers to use the outdoors, this transformed campus as a wonderful laboratory, not just for science and math, but for really the full spectrum of disciplines that are taught. I should mention, by the way, that our Space to Grow program has become a model across the country and to some extent internationally. Mayor Hidalgo in Paris has adopted it. They're doing green schoolyards based on our model. Rotterdam is doing it as well. And other countries have shown interest because of the power of it. And it brings together multiple benefits, serious environmental benefits, but also quality of life for our youth and for their safe places to recreate and experience nature for the neighborhood as well. And so we do develop programs then tied to this. And one of them, a very exciting one, is Birds in My Neighborhood. And this was brought to us by one of Openlands board members, Wendy Paulson, avid birder, great educator and conservationist. And when she was living in New York and then later in Washington, she started doing work in inner city schools to connect youth to nature through birds. And of course, here we are in Chicago on a major flyway. And yet, they're kind of invisible unless you really call attention to it. So this is a partnership with Audubon. We have volunteers that go in. Last year, 2,000, even with COVID, we were able to continue it, but obviously it was a challenge. We couldn't be in the classroom, but 2,000 kids have participated in the past year. And they then, we take them out to our forest preserves, to some of our wonderful natural areas like Midewin Tallgrass Prairie and others. And they lead the tours often with their siblings, with their parents, grandparents, and neighbors. And so it's a powerful program that introduces youth to nature close to home and develops skills that are transferable in many ways. And that's one example of the educational work that we do tied to these green campuses. We're not going to achieve our goals with public land alone. What are people doing in their own backyards? What are corporations doing with their campuses and so forth? So we have a pilot program in Lake County called Lands in Harmony. And we've worked last year with over 75 homeowners, all different scales, but helping them transform their landscapes. Often they're adjacent to public lands, to forest preserves and so forth. Obviously, birds and animals and nature, they don't care who owns it. They want to see continuity and connection. And so this is another way to create advocates, but also to really improve biodiversity and corridors for migration, so important today with the challenges of climate. So I'd like to show another little video here that talks about some of our larger landscape work. And if we could pull that up, I'd appreciate it. So that quote from George Overton, George was our co-founder with Jeff Short back in 1963. And he always told me when I was a kid coming back here, working on what became the Canal National Heritage Corridor, he said, Jerry, we must raise the threshold of hope. And I think that's very powerful. So, at Openlands, we feel that nature is vital to all people and it should be close to where they live. So that means at all different scales. And you saw, our schoolwork and, we worked with community gardens, trails, all sorts of things, the urban forest, engaging the public and understanding its significance, but most importantly, caring for it. But also, we need large landscapes. And so Hackmatac National Wildlife Refuge is a wonderful example. This will impact the lives of 12 million people in the greater Milwaukee, Chicago region. It's the first national wildlife refuge in our area. We have Senator Durbin to thank for his leadership in making it happen. Ultimately, it'll be about 20,000 acres of public and private land, bridging Wisconsin and Illinois, in Illinois primarily in McHenry County. We added last year about 800 acres, and this is a long-term project, but so significant. And it's something that illustrates, I think, the power of nature at all these scales. Spectacular landscape, wonderful opportunities, for hiking and biking and bird watching and canoeing and so forth. And so it's also quite beautiful in so many ways. But it's an effort, a work in progress. It'll take many years. And that's the other kind of dimension, I think, of an organization that's place-based like Openlands. We take the long view and incrementally keep adding, to the resources and addressing the opportunities, but also the challenges and threats. Another, of course, anchor in this big Chicago wilderness, three-state metro area is Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie. This is down in Will County, the former Joliet Arsenal. This is where TNT was created for World War II, for the Korean War, for Vietnam. When that was closed, Openlands and others said, this is our greatest opportunity to create a large landscape scale resource to bring prairie back to the prairie state. I mean, less than 1/100th of 1% of prairie is here. We've drained our wetlands, we plowed our prairie, so little of the original prairie, but we've also been a center for ecological restoration. And so that's very exciting to see the restoration that's happened. In fact, bison have come back, first time in 200 years. And we're beginning to see these marvelous natural areas coming back to life because of human intervention, because of restoration, because of volunteerism that's happening there. And a smaller scale, but very significant, is our Openlands Lakeshore Preserve. This is the southern part of the former Fort Sheridan. In the early 90s, when Fort Sheridan was closed, Openlands, with many others, advocated for the historic core of it, for the open spaces there to remain in the public domain. And the lakefront and the parade grounds and the open spaces were transferred to the Lake County Forest Preserve. A number of years later, the southern part of the fort, which was non-historic, had been transferred to the Navy. And the goal was to create improved housing for the Navy for Great Lakes and also market rate housing. But over a mile of lakefront, about 70 some acres, almost 80 acres of bluffs and ravines were so special and almost unique in terms of opportunity for the public to experience this landscape. And so we were asked to find a public agency to take it over. And for various reasons, it didn't work. People said, yes, it must be saved, but not us, not now. So Openlands, that typically does not own in perpetuity property, took this on, has restored the property, and it's really quite a marvelous resource. There's about 70 miles of lakefront in Illinois, half of which is in the city, and the other half, north, is largely private, with small parks that are really more appropriate for the local community. We, of course, have Illinois Beach State Park to the north near the Wisconsin border, and that's marvelous, but that's dune swale, kind of like Indiana Dunes, that Openlands also was involved in protecting early in its history. So here we have bluffs and ravines and dramatic views that are really extraordinary. So it may be small in terms of acres, but huge in impact. So to kind of bring this now to where we are today with climate, with the Biden administration, with opportunities for Illinois to really leverage the good work that's happening here and identify new resources to achieve much greater goals. America the Beautiful is the report that was issued in May by the National Climate Task Force that President Biden put together at the White House. And it underscores the global crisis that we're facing with extinction of species, the loss of biodiversity in our country and around the world. It really emphasizes that this nature crisis, exacerbated by climate change, also has implications for people's lives in very meaningful ways, for our economy and for our quality of life. And there are huge inequalities in terms of access to the outdoors. So we were very concerned when they were first talking about a climate initiative. And I'll be talking in just a minute here about something, maybe I'll put it on here now, 30 by 30. So this is to protect 30% of our land and water by permanently protected by the year 2030. E.O. Wilson, the great conservationist at Harvard, has said half the world. He has a wonderful book that talks about by 2050, we must protect half of the world if we're going to succeed in terms of addressing the extinction crisis and the climate crisis that we're living through. So this is moving in that direction. But for Illinois, how could we fit? Because the focus was so much on large landscapes, ranches, and wilderness areas out west and in other parts of the country. We only have less than 5% of our lands are permanently protected, public and private. How could we ever get to 30? And that's what's outlined here about our baseline, that, oh my God, it's a huge effort. But what we do have is farmland. 75% of the state is in agriculture. And so many advances have been made in terms of regenerative practices, even for conventional industrial agriculture, corn and soybeans, low-till setbacks from our rivers and streams, a whole range of tools. But also we've recognized how important food is and having it close to where people live. So there are many interesting opportunities here. And so the America the Beautiful report underscored both and. Yes, it's these large landscapes and we must protect them, but we also must improve nature and protect land at smaller scales in our metropolitan area where people live. And that means collaboration, innovative approaches. The report says that we must support locally led and designed programs. We also need to honor property rights. So it's encouraging voluntary programs where people would put conservation easements, permanent protection on their property, and programs like Lands in Harmony that I touched on, and always having science as the guide. So it's a pretty exciting time and a challenging time. And we were thrilled that the White House acknowledged the importance of scale, large and small, and working especially with underserved communities, Black, Brown, and challenged communities that are suffering in many cases the worst impact from climate change, where the tree canopy, is the least, flooding, heat islands, asthma, health issues, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, a big piece of this is jobs, green jobs. So we know that 37% of carbon sequestration can happen through nature-based solutions to climate, restoring our lands, replanting our forests. The programs like Space to Grow, transformation of landscapes that are not functioning well into functioning landscapes that address climate issues. We have so much deferred maintenance with our wonderful resources, our national parks, our state and local parks and forest preserves and so forth, and also a great need to establish more green space, quality green space at different scales close to where people live, especially in those areas that are hugely deficit. So with high unemployment, especially among underserved populations, with this great challenge, with an opportunity to introduce people to careers in the green industry, the Civilian Conservation Corps made so much sense. So at Openlands, we've been so fortunate to work over the last 18 months with Senator Durbin and also Congressman Rush on Renew Conservation Corps Act, which is really the most comprehensive of the various proposals that have surfaced in Congress to create a new 21st century Conservation Corps, or Climate Corps, as it's often called by the administration. This would be holistic in its approach, meaning projects of all scales, working from wilderness right down to small scale community opportunities, training for the participants. The original CCC of the New Deal, was only men. This would be diverse, all ages, especially focused on youth, of course. Very exciting. There seems to be growing momentum for this around the country. Organizations are advocating for it, citizens. We hope it'll be bipartisan and support. The goal is that this would be part of a reconciliation package, if and when that happens, and we're keeping our fingers crossed. But I think that the impact could be huge, especially in a metro area like Chicago and a state like Illinois, but really around the country. And I know, Nancy, you always said that we want to give your participants, kind of a call to action, opportunity to really make a difference. And so this is one, the America the Beautiful program that has so many important components, including this new CCC, needs to be supported. So I ask all of you really to reach out to our delegation, reinforcing the importance of this, thanking Senator Durbin and Congressman Rush for their incredible leadership. We have a great business plan behind their legislation as well. A Chicago firm, West Monroe Partners, volunteered to really put together an extraordinarily detailed and robust business plan to support the legislation. So we're well positioned to implement it once it happens. Anyway, I kind of rambled on here quite a bit, but maybe Nancy, you could join me, and if there are questions that have come up in chat, or Nancy, if you have things that you'd like to ask. But it's been such a pleasure to share this with all of you today. And let's see if we can get Nancy back on the screen.
Warwick is trying to bring me back on the screen. I see a little corner of me, but you don't need to see me because you can hear. What we want you to know is that that's the most optimistic and hopeful view of planning for the future. I love the way you talk about visions for the long term, and the cooperation that is in everything you do, as I tried to point out earlier. There wasn't a project you mentioned that didn't require partnerships and collaboration and people of all ages. It was just beautiful. I do want people to know that Openlands has, can you see that on the screen? They have an annual luncheon on October 14, and you can visit it either virtually or in person. And I don't know about all the fees and all of that, but you can go to Openlands and find out. Dick Durbin is going to be honored, and it'll be wonderful. They're always marvelous and joyous. I cry at all of them because they're so positive, and you can cry about good things as well as bad things. We do have one question so far, and questions are very important. I think Jerry is prepared and willing and eager to answer. But one comes from Leonard Conman, who's comes to many of our programs. He lives at Fort Sheridan and wonders about the closing of that beautiful trail you mentioned because of some old armaments that are still there. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, well, let me try to briefly give you the context there. So, of course, this was a fort, and they did all sorts of exercises and so forth, including munitions and whatnot. So now, about 5 months ago, unexploded ordnance, hand grenades, were found on several locations, several times in several locations. We were very concerned. We don't know, there's been a lot of erosion because of the rising lake levels and so forth with the bluffs. Did they erode out? Did they come from the lake? We immediately closed the reserve out of concern, obviously, for safety. I mean, a young child picking up one of these, they were live. So we immediately turned to the Army and Navy because they had transferred this property to us, saying we had a clean bill of health. And quite frankly, we had a very hard time even getting their attention. I have good news to present, though. It's been a struggle throughout. And I know how frustrating for people who have come to love that site, as we do, and especially for those of you who live right next door. It's been a terrible missed opportunity during the summer season to not be able to enjoy those magnificent views and the Lakefront Trail and so forth. But finally, thanks to the leadership of our congressional delegation, of our senators, in particular, Durbin and Duckworth and Congressman Schneider, finally got the attention of the Army and the Navy. They are getting experts out there to comprehensively survey the entire property with state-of-the-art to find out if there's any unexploded ordnance still there. If so, it will be removed. They will also be looking at the lake bed close to the reserve. So I doubt that we'll be able to open it quickly. It's still going to be probably a couple months to get that work done, but they're committed. The funding is there. And we're thrilled. It should have happened 4.5 months ago, but it didn't. And we were persistent, and our elected officials. Also, I want to say that Mayor Rotering has been marvelous, and Highland Park advocating as well. And so it was a united front. And finally, we got through. The commitment is there. And so worst case scenario, we'll open in the spring. I would hope we can open this winter. But first, we have to do all of this work to determine if there are risks still, if they do uncover something that is removed and cleaned up. And I can't wait, quite frankly, for that time. Yeah.
Wonderful. And next question from Iris Wachowski. What is happening with the rising lakefront to the Chicago waterfront, the rising lake? I'm sorry, Iris, I botched up your question. The rise of Lake Michigan, how is it threatening the city's lakefront?
Well, huge challenge, obviously. And again, we have especially Senator Durbin to thank. He was the author of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, a funding initiative, multi-year for work in the Great Lakes, addressing these challenges. And with climate change, we're going to see the waters go up and down at a pace that we've never seen before. The answers are not simple, but we do have resources to really try to bring the best science to bear here and figure it out. But I think it's a huge challenge. And I'm sure many of you, saw that series in the New York Times. The water challenges. I mean, we are a city that's built on a swamp after all. And so while we have lots of water, we at times have too much of it as well. And there are no simple answers, but there are a lot of good people focused on it, coming up with the best solutions and the best mitigation possible. So yes, huge issue, work in progress. And, it's something that we're going to have to live with for generations, quite frankly.
And as I understand from your talk just now, that working to increase wetlands helps with that project or helps contain some of that water too. It makes a big
Absolutely.
difference.
There's in the Calumet area, in fact, I think it was just yesterday in the Tribune, there was a wonderful story about public agencies working with Audubon, the Cook County Forest Preserve, restoring Powderhorn Lake. We and others are involved in major wetland restorations throughout the region. And so bringing back our wetlands, which are our sponges, absorbing this water, is critical. And at different scales and throughout the metropolitan area. I mentioned Midewin as the first national tallgrass prairie. Well, in fact, a lot of that is wetland that's being restored. We've done it. The Wetlands Initiative, which is another wonderful not-for-profit, are working there. Volunteers are involved in many of these projects as well because it's labor intensive. Deer Grove, which is the first of the Cook County Forest Preserves, we've been able to partner with them on massive restoration to see the change is extraordinary. And we did studies before on the hydrology and have shown that it's reduced flooding dramatically in properties adjacent. It's improved habitat and biodiversity. And it's also been an economic boon because the area is so beautiful and attracting so many people for recreation. So I think we have to always look at the multiple benefits that come from nature-based solutions and restoring our natural systems so that they function well. It impacts our lives and our well-being on every level, personal, social, economic, and of course, ecological. Yeah, definitely.
There are two questions about Route 53, and I know that Openlands was active in supporting that work being an open corridor. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So the extension of Route 53 north in Lake County would go through one of the most sensitive, from an ecological point of view, landscapes in the upper Midwest, some of the rarest nature, extraordinary. This has been a proposal for decades. Conservationists, of course, extremely concerned. And there was a task force that was put together to see if a plan could be developed that would both be sensitive to the environment and also address the transportation issues. They came up with recommendations that would be extremely costly, very difficult to do. And in the end, the state decided the road makes no sense, that yes, there are significant transportation issues, but this is not the answer. You need a more holistic, comprehensive approach. Meanwhile, the state has acquired a lot of property. So there's this open green corridor adjacent to communities that would offer extraordinary opportunities for trail development, for linkage between towns and other open spaces that would protect amazing biodiversity and natural areas and habitat, but also address climate issues because there are serious flooding and other challenges. So the legislature in Springfield has established a task force. Appointments will be made soon to look at the future of this land. And we're hopeful that this could become a new kind of greenway or climate corridor that again addresses many opportunities. And since the state has already invested in these properties, how can they best be put to use to improve the quality of life in that region and especially for the communities that border it? So I think a happy resolution in many ways. Openlands is not opposed to development. We live in a metropolitan area, but we want quality. And we feel that, the important natural areas and open spaces should be removed from the development equation. And we need to look then collectively and holistically at land use decisions. And so I think this is actually a great one to kill a road that made really very little transportation sense and certainly no environmental sense, to look at other transportation improvements that can address traffic, but then to see that wonderful corridor as a great new green open space opportunity, addressing the 30 by 30 opportunity of Biden, and also giving residents of Northern Illinois a great new outdoor and environmental resource. Yeah.
So I have one more question, unless some other people come on fast with some extras. Tell me, Mark Shields asked about the connection of Openlands to Rails to Trails.
Yes. So as I mentioned briefly, the Prairie Path, so this was an abandoned railroad that had a lot of prairie plants along it because the railroads, they didn't want trees growing there. They would burn. Well, fire is part of the, kind of the rhythm of the prairie. Native Americans started it and natural conditions. And that's how we keep, otherwise we'd be all forest here, quite frankly, but for fire. And of course, with suppression of fire, we lost so much of the prairie, and that, of course, plowed and drained wetlands and so forth. But along that railroad corridor, a lot of prairie still survived. And so May Theogard Watts, a great educator and conservationist, approached Gunnar Peterson, who was our founding executive director, visionary guy, and said, help us. We want to have this transferred and converted into a hiking and biking and horseback riding trail, but protecting and enhancing all this wonderful biodiversity. And so that was the first in the nation. Openlands has worked on a number of other, like the old Plank Road Trail and Will and Cook counties and various other abandoned railroads converted into trails. Fortunately, there's a national movement, the Rails to Trails Conservancy, and it's very exciting. And they're looking at connections, all across the country, not focused exclusively on rail corridors, but that was the primary focus. So again, a good example of how often Openlands kind of pioneers an idea, somebody picks it up, and then it takes on a life of its own, not unlike focus on the Great Lakes, as I mentioned. Lee Botts was with Gunnar Peterson. It was a small office, but dynamic group of people. And Lee said, nobody's looking at Lake Michigan. What a tragedy. And we need to. And so she launched, under the umbrella of Openlands, Lake Michigan Federation. Over time, that expanded to include all of the Great Lakes, and now this very powerful, wonderful regional conservation group, which is the Alliance for the Great Lakes. So in a similar way, our early work with converting abandoned railroads into these hiking and biking trails helped launch really a national movement, which is represented by a national organization, Rails to Trails Conservancy. And we work with them in partnership. They're hoping to do more. I think in Illinois for a while, they didn't have staff here, but we're in conversations with them, some exciting sort of transcontinental trail opportunities. Durs Anderson and my staff, who is our Greenways director, is just extraordinary and a very quiet leader, but has been involved in so many of these trails, including a number of the national efforts, and has been a coordinator really here in Illinois to make sure that the programs that are proposed from coast to coast don't leave us out, and that Illinois is part of that. Yeah.
I love the way you bring in the ancient history to boost national current activities with that answer. So the last question from Beth Sonnenschein, how do we catch up the urban canopy in Chicago that you mentioned that we're behind on the urban canopy, and how do you recommend that we try to catch up?
Yeah, we're way behind. And it's tragic because the impact on people's lives is huge. The impact on nature is huge. So I think there are a number of things. One, increasing citizen participation and advocacy is essential. So our Tree Keeper program, we have a waiting list for people to take these classes. Over 2,500 have already from all walks of life. This is the 30th anniversary of that. So if someone is living in Chicago and really wants to actively get involved in caring for the urban forest, that's an opportunity. Sign up. They're marvelous. They're taught by tree care professionals from the Park District, the city, the industry, Morton Arboretum, and really wonderful. There's very little coordination in the city proper, which is unfortunate, between agencies. So the Bureau of Forestry, but then you've got, Streets and Sand and the Water Department, and all these things that are going on that impact trees, putting in new stormwater and water mains and cutting down mature trees, often when you don't have to. Very few policies in place. Our Bureau of Forestry does good work, but very little coordination. Part of that is that after Mayor Daley, the Department of Environment was abolished. And so that's hard. So for several years, Openlands, our tree keepers, and many others advocated for an urban forestry advisory board that would bring together all of the governmental players so that they know what Left Hand is doing with relative to right, and also bring together professional expertise from the industry, from the not-for-profit world. That legislation passed, and the mayor is going to be appointing soon this advisory board. That'll go a long way. The other thing is that part of the initiative of the 30 by 30, the climate focus, Civilian Conservation Corps opportunity will bring significant resources for urban forestry, for forestry across the country, both dollars in terms of buying more trees and planting them, but also engaging and training young people and adults to care for them and focus on jobs. For instance, before COVID, the tree care industry in the metropolitan area, they had 800 jobs that weren't filled one year, but there's not a pipeline for it. So we launched this apprenticeship program. It's the first in Illinois, one of the first in the country. It's small right now in its first year, but going to grow. But it's a partnership with the industry, with the Department of Labor, giving training to young people, often of very diverse backgrounds, so that they can actually have meaningful, well-paying jobs. The other thing is that Monday, tomorrow, the city is going to be unveiling their budget. And we're hopeful that there's going to be significant new resources for forestry, both in terms of added staff and capacity and dollars, because they recognize that this is not a luxury, but the urban forest is a necessity. And then, as I mentioned before, we have one of the greatest institutions in the country, Morton Arboretum, right here, in DuPage County. And so they have brought to bear the incredible talent of their scientists to study the urban forest, to document where we are, invasive species, these challenges, and so forth, and work through the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and others to really get all of the communities involved in a concerted effort to expand and improve our urban forest, both with new resources, but also with new insight and science and best practices. So I think you're going to see a lot of activity on many fronts. And if people want to keep informed about some of these policy things, we send out alerts. Just go to our website, openlands.org, sign up, you'll get them. If you're interested in getting actively involved yourself as a volunteer, as a steward, sign up for Tree Keepers. It's a marvelous program, it really is. And as I also mentioned briefly, it's not just the city, we're developing chapters in many of the suburbs as well. So a huge opportunity to impact climate and quality of life, and suddenly new opportunities on the horizon relative to funding and programs that we didn't have before. We want to leverage that and seize those opportunities so that we aren't left out. Because there was some focus about, well, it's just for the fires out west and, replanting and fire prevention. And yes, that's critical, but don't forget the smaller scale and important scale of our cities and the urban forest. And they're all coming together under the same umbrella, which is really marvelous. Yeah.
So thank you, Jerry. We ask for action, activities to be mentioned that people can actually do. And you've given us quite a workload, and that's wonderful. And I'll close with one more. Marcia Dams asked, how do we get the Reed Turner Woods, which is out near Long Grove? Yes, Long Grove, thank you. How do we get that to be part of Openlands? So with that, you can think about that, and I'll tell Marcia afterwards. But it's another action for Openlands that does so much, that it makes all of our lives so much happier, more beautiful. It makes our air better, our water better, and gives peace when we need to have more peace. Thank you, Jerry Adelmann, for everything you do and for Openlands and everything Openlands does. And let's all keep busy. All right. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Nancy. It's been a great honor and pleasure.